An EQ, just making sure there's no sort of rumble underneath sort of 50 hertz. I don't, like I said, I like my beats nice and low endy because I don't worry about my sub. I'll get to that later, but they don't interfere with my sub. In this instance, I've put a little bit of a limiter on these drums just to kind of bring them together a bit because there's quite a few different breaks and stuff. I kind of wanted them all to sit. And the limiter is fairly transparent. It's only got a sort of threshold of -2 and the out ceiling's -1. So really, if you look at its attenuation, it's only just catching the peaks, but it is kind of beefing up the drums ever so slightly. Got to be careful with limiting your drums though. I mean, it's not something that I do too often. I don't squeeze. If I do it, I do it subtly. I don't squeeze the life out of my drums. You have to make sure that when you look at your signal that it's got a lot of dynamics. If you squeeze them too much, you'll just have a big fat block, and basically what you'll end up with is a lifeless tune. It'll be loud, but it'll be artificially loud. You know, you'll kind of be listening to it in your studio and it'll be so loud, you'll be like, yeah, this is banging. Get into a club, and what you've got to realise in a club, it's going to be limited again, and presumably you're probably going to be limiting it on your master, or a mastering engineer is going to be limited, so that every time you start limiting stuff, you're going to be gradually squeezing the dynamics out of it, and dynamics are what kind of give a tune life and punch. So the limiter that I put on here is just literally to just bring the drums and the breaks together a little bit, and just to cap the peaks. It's not really squashing them too much. The EQ, basically, every time you limit something, it's good to just make sure there's no rumble, because even though you can't hear the rumble, it can affect how the limiter's working, and it will just kind of, it will muddy up your low end. I don't bus my hats and crashes to that bus, so I like to keep them separate from my sort of drums and my breaks, just to kind of sit them on top. I also find if you are limiting, then that kind of, it can affect the top end depending on what limiter you use. So those hats are going to bus 3, and there's actually a bit of a bit crusher on there, just doing a little bit of drive to kind of brighten them a bit and to just rough them up a little bit, because the breaks are so sort of old and rugged. I wanted my hats to be a little bit sort of lower quality than they are. I'm sure there's a few people that probably think this is madness, trying to kind of make your sounds sound worse, but in the context of the tune, I think it works. So. Okay, so my beats are done. If you look at my arrange, this is another just little tip actually. Like, it looks fairly empty, but what I've done is I've packed all my drums into a folder. So in that folder, that's my drums mix, and I like to do that because otherwise you end up with, you know, 60 or 70 tracks on a page, and it can be a bit of a nightmare. So yeah, that's just a little kind of tip on just keeping your arrange tidy and organised, because it helps when you come to mix your tune down. Now we've got the drum groove. I usually then go straight to making my bass and my bass line, and once I've got that, I sort of start working on the rest of the arrangement of the tune. So I'll just play you the sort of first drop of the tune so you can hear what the end result is, and then I'll show you how I made the bass. Okay, so it's quite a sort of busy, well, it's quite a simple bass line notation wise. I'm not a musical genius, I'm more a groove bass producer. I don't go mad with the notes, I choose simple patterns, but that just work with the sounds and the groove of the drums. So if I go into my bass folder, because I've packed all the tracks into this folder here, this is my bass folder. It looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. For this bass line, I've actually stolen probably one of the most rinsed presets of the current era of production, which is the massive Brutal Electro. I hear it in about sort of 3 tunes a week that I get sent, and there's probably a reason for that. It is a great sound, but the way I've used it is kind of, it's not so bait, because I've kind of just I've resampled it and I put it in a sampler. So you probably recognise that. Now I've just taken one sample of it, because the thing I like about resampling is, even though at that you can hear the slight sort of motions and movements that the Massive's doing to it with its filters and its envelopes, like when you pitch that up, if you've only got one sort of sample like stretched across your keyboard, you kind of get a different characteristic up here, because those sort of motions are now speeding up. So, you know, if you start LFOing this sound in the sampler, you kind of get like more character to the sound. Obviously, if you want to go really high up, it's not going to run. So you can just do a multi-sample, but I knew what my bass line was going to be, because it was in my head, and I knew I didn't have to go that far. So if I go into the sampler here, you can see it's just one sample stretched across. I don't think I've looped it or anything in there. I put a bandpass filter on it, and I'm basically going to control this filter using the modulation matrix on the EXS24. So I've got LFO1 at 3/16 there, going to the filter cutoff, and now we're starting to get like a bit of motion in it, and it's you know a bit like a talk boxy kind of sound. I've also got like a duplicate of that sampler down here doing the last note of the bass line, and the reason it's different is because I just wanted a bit more of an attack on this one. So the answer to that bass is a bit slower, and I mean you can do it in the same sampler by messing around with it, but I'm a bit lazy. So that's like the sort of foundation of the bass line. I wanted a bit more motion in it, so I've set up these ghost sidechain tracks. The tracks in black here are like ghost signals. Like I explained earlier with the drums, there's no output on the sampler, which has got a kick and that one's got a snare. Going to bus 7 and 8 on the mixer, which is here. So you can see these are all my sidechain buses where they're just sort of empty signals. And they're obviously going to compressors on the bass. You can see it's quite subtle again. There's quite a quick release, so it's not holding it for too long. But the effect that it's having on both basses is sort of gelling where the notes meet by sort of dipping them out. And obviously that's going to help in the mix of the drums as well, because there'll be a lot more sort of room for the kicks and the snares. I've also got an EQ on both these basses, rolling off the sub, because I'm going to have a separate sub to deal with that sort of area, and taking out these sort of rogue harmonics that you can hear. You can hear these like clicks and sort of stuff in the bass that I didn't really want, so I've got the same EQ on both of those and the same sort of compression setting. The next step I did was to kind of take a bounce of that as audio, so I could layer it with itself and affect it differently. So I took a bounce and basically decided to distort it. On any normal day I'd probably use a guitar rig or an amplitude or ohm force, ohmicide. For some reason I was feeling a bit fruity, and I actually ran the sound out of the sound card into this guitar pedal here, this Boss ME50. There's something to be said for using a little bit of hardware equipment every now and then. Sound like an old fogey. I didn't used to believe people when they say that it adds warmth, because I didn't really understand what that meant, but it does add a character to the sound that you find it quite hard to get through plugins. And also you've got the hands-on kind of experience of just, you know, tweaking it with the knobs and stuff. So the affected sound ended up like this. And that's more like it. That's the vibe I was going for. It's got a lot more grit now, and it's got a sound like a cabinet emulation sound on it, like it's going through a guitar amp. So the next thing I did after that was chopped this up as audio to add a bit more rhythm to the bass line. So if I zoom in here, you can just see that where I've chopped it, and I put little fades on each, just to kind of stop it from popping and clicking. And that's going to sit on top of the bass line. So I don't really need a lot of low in that. So in both those channels there, one's just doing sort of the end bass there. I don't know why they're separate. So I've got an EQ on there, just rolling off pretty much from the low mids down, because I just want this to be a top endy sort of effect. I bussed both of these as well to a bus where I've got an EQ doing a similar kind of low cut. One thing you'll find with EQs is you think you've taken out the frequency, but then if you put another EQ on doing the same thing, you'll find it's actually taking out even more. So, you know, sometimes you'll have like a lot of different EQs looking like they're doing the same thing, but there's definitely a reason for it. I've dipped out around sort of 610 Hertz, because that's where the vocal in this tune seems to be sitting. So obviously if I've got this top-endy sort of bass and I've got a vocal as well, you need to make room for that. And I've also brightened up the tops, because the whole point of this is to just add a sort of brightness and grit to the top end. I've got a sample delay, a Logic sample delay on here as well, and what this is doing is actually sort of widening the sound out, because I ran it through the guitar pedal, which actually is mono. I like my top end of my basses to be stereo. Low end should definitely, or almost definitely, be mono, because you'll have problems with phasing in clubs, and you just want it to be down the middle. So yeah, I've set that to 641 samples delayed on the right, so it's effectively splitting the sound and playing it on the right side ever so slightly after the left, which is kind of giving like a sort of a width to it. Another EQ, again taking out the bottom, because I must have just, as I was going through it, figured out I needed more, and I didn't want to touch that EQ. And then this plug-in here, this is the key to kind of keeping your sample delay in check. When you use sample delay, like I said, you get problems with phasing sometimes. You listen to something in mono and something you put sample delay on suddenly disappears because